So welcome to economics, and this is our very first lecture video. So it's going to be quite an adventure that will be going on here. In this pane over here, with my hand and my pen, is actually a copy of the problem set. So if you have one, that might make it a little bit easier for you to come follow along and take notes and things like that. The very first lecture is here, lecture L1.1 Fundamentals number 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take notes basically as I'm presenting so that you can, rest assured that I'm not going to rush through these so that we can talk through them as we do them. The first thing to know about economics is actually just what it is. And economics is the study of scarcity. And so we might want to know what scarcity is. So that idea is econ's the study of scarcity. And we would say that is how people, and I'm just going to abbreviate here, you can too, how people deal with unlimited wants and needs, right? And realistically, most of what we have are wants, but they have limited, we might say, resources. So what does that mean? Well, it means you have limited time and money and natural resources and labor and all these things. And so you can't have everything, right? It's not Star Trek where you have a replicator or something. There is a limitation, and that's the fundamental problem. And so we have to make choices is the idea. And so how do we make those choices is really what economics is all about. So we have these things called incentives, which are the motivations behind our choices. And so we would say, you have an incentive maybe to study in economics because then, you might do well on an exam and then, it goes into your GPA and so forth and so on. So you have reasons for why you would allocate your time and your labor resource is when we say time, we really mean labor resource into doing something. Down here, we say that when we say we've made a choice, let's say we choose to study, right? Then we're making a choice and we're choosing to not do something, right? You're giving something up. And in a realistic sense, you're giving something up by enrolling in economics. And so the opportunity cost is actually what is given up to do something. And so again, maybe I should apologize at the outset. My handwriting is terrible, but it's the idea here is what do you give up? So sometimes we call it opportunity lost because it's the thing that you didn't do. It's not the money that you spent. So like, let's say you go buy a sandwich and you go, well, the opportunity cost is $4.99. No, it's what you would have done with those $4.99 that actually is the opportunity cost. In market economies, we actually use these, right, primarily to study because in these kinds of systems, the decisions are freely made. So we would say that these are systems in which the decisions are freely made. Decisions are freely made. And that's the idea that we can study these kinds of decision-making processes and not worry about that maybe there's something else going on. Now, we're going to get more into detail about, that market economies aren't always perfect and that sometimes they end up creating what are sometimes called market failures. But for right now, kind of suffice it to say that we know that we actually are just going to use market economies in economics. We're not going to study command economies in which governments and other institutions tell companies what to produce and tell people what to do. We would say that in a market economy, the critical thing is that the property rights create the incentives. Property rights are the incentives. So in other words, if you have property in a market system, you have an incentive to improve it and to take care of it and so forth because you own it and you can derive benefit from that. In a command economy, that's less true, we would say. So here's a quick little picture for you, this cartoon, educational evolution. And the question here I have for you is, what's the opportunity cost of going to college? Well, it's not the tuition, room, and board, right? That's a common mistake that students make. But in fact, it's what you gave up. It's what you would have done. So it's the job that you would have gone and gotten. It's the various life experiences that you would have had as opposed to the dollars that you spent, right? So it's kind of the choice, the alternative choice. And maybe, thinking about what you would have done with those dollars had you not spent them or borrowed them. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about a second feature of the fundamentals of economics, and that's called resources. So resources are anything used to make, right, used to make or produce something else. Anything used to make something else. And so sometimes we call them AKA factors. And so in history class, maybe you learned the factors of production, right? That's a possibility. In this class, we're going to call them resources. You may also see them called factors of production. They're used interchangeably. And the idea of scarcity here is key, right? We don't have enough resources to do everything we want to do. That's kind of what we were just talking about. So we're going to divide resources into 4 categories. And thankfully, you only really have to worry about 3 of the 4. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So every resource that could ever, anything that could ever be used to produce something else can fit into one of these 4 categories. So the first one is land, and that would be nature resources, right? Or you could say natural resources if you want to be grammatical. And so we would say timber, right? That would be wood and paper products, things like that. Wheat, right? We would say wheat, corn, oil, then I've got a list there. Any kinds of those things, coal, right? Fresh water, that kind of stuff. So labor are the worker resources. And we would say that you can have better quality of those, right? You could invest in your human capital, as sometimes you might see that. So we would say these are literally the workers. That's the example here, workers. And sometimes you'll see that phrase human capital. All that means is the quality of your workers, right? Human capital equals the quality of labor. And so if you're investing in human capital, you're improving maybe the training of your workers, you're making them better at producing things, that kind of stuff, right? The third thing listed here, and by the way, I mentioned that human capital because sometimes it gets really confusing if you see the next word is capital. So we have this thing called capital, and those are products, right? Tangible things that are not land, that are not labor, that are used to make other stuff. So we might say that these are products used to produce. So I know that's a really broad statement, but in general, there are 2 categories. You have physical capital, and that's normally when we talk about capital, what we're going to mean. And that's like tools and machines and factories, right? Machines, factories. And in a real sense, if we're producing like a service, like this service of education, the camera that I'm using here, the laptop, all of the little doodads that I'm using, those are physical capital. And we would also say sometimes you may have seen financial capital, and that's what when we say financial capital, we usually just mean that that's the dollars used to buy physical capital. Right? So it's kind of like the idea of, sometimes you'll hear capitalism. That's the idea of accumulating capital, particularly how are we going to accumulate products used to produce other products. And it's really reliant on private ownership of those things as well. The last thing is entrepreneurship, and this is the kind of organization of your resources. Organization of resources. And this is how you combine them all together. So it's an intangible. Intangible. Now that means, intangible just means that you can't touch it. So we can't trade it, non-tradable, right? I can't sell you entrepreneurship. I can foster it. I can encourage it with a legal framework that encourages risk-taking and innovation and creativity, right? So a few things that you could do, and if you're a country and you're like, yeah, I really want to be more entrepreneurial, you could create robust bankruptcy laws, right? That's an easy one. And a lot of people don't realize that, but bankruptcy laws are really important because it encourages you to take risks. It's like, hey, go start a new business. It's not the end of the world if it fails, because you're not saddled for the rest of your life with debt, right? So things like that are really, really important when we talk about entrepreneurship. And it's important for economic growth, but we aren't going to model it, right? We're not going to say like, well, how do we, increase the demand for entrepreneurs? We're not going to do that. With all of these others, though, we're going to spend a little bit more time modeling them. And you can buy and sell those. So the next thing here, and the last thing in today's lecture, is actually just the two different fields of economics. And if you watch the welcome video, I talked a little bit about that. Microeconomics is the study of how firms, which is just a fancy word for companies, and individuals, how they make economic decisions. And when we say economic decisions, what do we mean? We mean, how do they deal with the problem of scarcity? Right? That's all that it really is. So what are we studying in microeconomics? We're studying how they set prices, right? How do businesses and individuals come to price agreements? How do we decide how much to produce? How many workers to hire at the local Baskin Robbins or Dairy Queen or whatever? And then macroeconomics is the study of fluctuations. What a great word, or changes. And I'm going to use a little triangle here. You're going to see that triangle come a lot. It's actually a delta. Changes in economic conditions, or fluctuations in economic conditions, and how governments respond to that, how government responds. And so we would say things like unemployment, inflation, what we call gross domestic product, which is the value of all the things that we produce. That's what's really studied in macroeconomics. And so a quick little table here, this is from an older version of the textbook. Should I go to college or get a job after high school? That's a microeconomic because it's one person. How many people are employed in the whole economy, on the other hand, that's a macroeconomic because it's the whole economy. We skip down here. What determines the overall trade in goods, services, and assets between the United States and the rest of the world? Again, macro meaning big, huge. What determines the number of iPhones exported to France? Now, I like that one at the very bottom of micro because it says France, right? And you might go, that's macro. It's the whole thing. One product. So it's going to be micro. So sometimes it's a little hard to tell the difference. And we're going to have some practice problems here shortly that'll help you with that. So hopefully you've taken some good notes, and I'll see you next time.